LangChain with Pinecone Vector Store. This system leverages LangChain and Pinecone to provide a conversational AI experience. User input. Receives text input from the user. Capture user queries or prompts. Passes the input to text pre-processing. Initiates the system's processing pipeline. Text pre-processing. Transforms raw text into a format suitable for embedding. Tokenizes, cleans, and normalizes the input text. Receives input from user input and sends processed text to embedding. Prepares the input for embedding. Embedding. Converts text into numerical vectors. Generates vector representations of the processed text using a suitable model. Receives processed text from text pre-processing and sends the vector to Pinecone Vector Store. Transforms text into a format suitable for similarity comparisons. Pinecone Vector Store. Stores and retrieves vector embeddings. Stores the generated vectors for efficient retrieval based on similarity. Receives vectors from embedding, stores them, and retrieves similar vectors based on user queries. Provides a database of vectors for similarity-based retrieval. Retrieval. Retrieves text relevant to the user input. Identifies text corresponding to the most similar vectors in the Pinecone Vector Store. Receives the user input vector from embedding. Queries the Pinecone Vector Store, and sends retrieved text to text generation. Finds relevant information based on similarity to the user query. Text generation. Generates a response based on the retrieved text. Utilizes a language model to create a coherent and relevant response based on the retrieved information. Receives relevant text from retrieval and sends the generated response to response. Formulates the response based on the retrieved information. Response. Provides the final output to the user. Displays the generated response to the user. Receives the generated response from text generation. Delivers the final output to the user. User input. Text pre-processing. Data flow. The user input is passed to the text pre-processing component for processing. Text pre-processing. Embedding. Data flow. The processed text is sent to the embedding component to generate vectors. Embedding. Pinecone Vector Store. Data flow. The generated vectors are stored in the Pinecone Vector Store. Embedding. Retrieval. Data flow. The user input vector is sent to the retrieval component to find similar vectors. Retrieval. Text generation. Data flow. The retrieved text is sent to the text generation component to generate a response. Text generation. Response. Data flow. The generated response is sent to the response component to be displayed to the user. Response. Pinecone Vector Store. Data flow. The generated response can be used to enrich the Pinecone Vector Store, potentially updating it with new knowledge. The central hub of the system, responsible for orchestrating interactions and processing requests, represents the external user who interacts with the system. Provides queries to the LangChain system. Query. Data flow. Provides queries to the LangChain system. The user's input to the system, typically in the form of natural language, captures user intent and acts as a starting point for processing. LangChain. Data flow. Passed to LangChain for further processing. The core language processing engine responsible for understanding and generating text processes the query, leverages vector databases for context retrieval, and generates responses. Query. Data flow. Receives the user query for processing. Process query. Control flow. Initiates processing of the query. Vector database. Data flow. Retrieves relevant information from the vector database. The step where LangChain analyzes the query and determines appropriate actions. Interprets the query and decides how to proceed. potentially involving information retrieval or other actions. LangChain. Control flow. Receives control from LangChain to start processing. Generate response. Control flow. Moves control to the response generation phase, the stage where the system constructs the response to the user. Formulates a coherent and informative response based on the processed query and retrieved information. Process query. Control flow. Receives control from the query processing phase. Response. Data flow. Generates the response for the user. Retrieve embeddings. Control flow. Initiates retrieval of relevant embeddings from the vector database. The final output of the system, conveyed to the user, presents the generated response in a user-friendly format. Generate response. Data flow. Receives the generated response for display. User. Data flow. Delivers the response to the user. A storage system for storing and retrieving information in a structured format. Stores embeddings vector representations of information and allows retrieval based on similarity. Searches. LangChain. Data flow. Provides relevant information to LangChain for response generation. Store embeddings. Control flow. Handles the storage of embeddings. The process of storing information in the vector database. Converts information into embeddings and stores them in the vector database. Vector database. Control flow. Receives control to store embeddings in the vector database. Pinecone. Data flow. Transmits embeddings to the Pinecone database. A specific vector database implementation. Acts as the backend storage mechanism for the vector database, managing embeddings and enabling efficient retrieval. Store embeddings. Data flow. Receives embeddings for storage. Retrieve embeddings. Data flow. Provides retrieved embeddings to LangChain for response generation. The process of retrieving information from the vector database. Searches the vector database for embeddings similar to the query and retrieves the relevant information. Generate response. Control flow. Receives control from the response generation phase to retrieve embeddings. Pinecone. Data flow. Requests embeddings from the Pinecone database.